George will be the last presentation. George's been a good friend for a long time and a nice mentor, particularly when I was a young scholar in Michigan. George is going to talk about neighborhood decay and the dynamics of crime, implications for policy. So George Galster is the Clarence Hillberry Professor of Urban Affairs at Wayne State University.
Good morning. Let me also add my thanks to the organizers of this conference and start with a confession. I was trained at MIT as a neoclassical economist. And therefore, I consider myself a recovering economist, and I'm embarking on a 12-step plan for my recovery. I have succeeded in the first step. I have admitted that I have a problem. But my second step is to participate in a panel on the sociology of neighborhoods. So here goes. What I hope to do is to extend on where we just heard the last presentation and try to understand more about what makes a neighborhood more or less dangerous. And what I will do in this presentation is, first of all, get some basic terminology out of the way about what we're going to mean by certain aspects of the physical environment, vacant homes and abandoned homes. Talk about our research question. Lay out a conceptual framework which I hope tries to connect a lot of the issues that we've discussed this morning already. That is, market forces, the demographic and economic composition of neighborhoods, the physical conditions in neighborhoods, and the safety of neighborhoods. And to lay this model out as a very multidimensional, complicated, mutually causal framework, a part of which only I'm going to talk about empirically estimating today. Then I'll talk about our application of a piece of this model using data from my hometown, Detroit, Michigan, highlight some of the key results, show how our results tell us something about the process of neighborhood decline, which unfortunately Detroit knows much about, and how that relates to the safety of the neighborhoods as they decline. And last but not least, to talk about the policy implications of these findings. So, we have, of course, in Detroit, the basket case for neighborhood decline, perhaps in the world. We now have a situation where within the boundaries of the municipality of Detroit, approximately 1/3, yes, 1/3 of our territory is either vacant buildings like this or vacant land like that. And there's vestiges of neighborhoods that exist in many places of my city, and some of them are vacant, such as the left-hand picture. Even though it's boarded up, we're going to count this in this study as a vacant home that potentially could be occupied. And that's opposed to the right-hand side. And we'll be using the term abandonment frequently, but we're meaning about totally bombed-out house that's vacant, open to the elements, often has had fire damage, is clearly a wreck and not capable of being brought back into the housing stock. Now, these aspects of our community, of course, are important on the horizons of our citizens. A recent poll of Detroit residents places abandoned buildings and crime as by far the two most major concerns of quality of life. And not only are they the two major concerns, but other types of studies have suggested there was a relationship between them. So we see, for example, in the Detroit Free Press recently, the comment that vacant homes are dangerous threats. They can become dens of criminal activity, or worse, the lairs of rapists. And thus it's motivated a highly publicized campaign to knock down blighted structures, to clear the landscape of these vestiges of neighborhoods to create essentially open prairie. So that leads to the research question that I'll focus on today. To what extent do vacant and abandoned dwellings, plus a wide variety of other block-level indicators of neighborhood decline, predict a wide range of crime types during the subsequent quarter, controlling for a variety of socio-demographic and physical characteristics of the block and crime conditions on nearby blocks? Now, to set up this research, I promised I'd give a conceptual framework in which I think we can understand the relationship between neighborhood decline and crime dynamics, and here it is. That's usually the reaction I get to my flow diagrams. So don't panic. I'm going to walk through this slowly and broad brush a lot of it. The fundamental point of American neighborhoods is that they are driven by metropolitan-wide forces. And so the flows that govern neighborhood health of people and resources are flows that flow across a metropolitan area. So the far left-hand side says, if you're looking at a particular neighborhood, you have to understand what its competitive position is relative to all the other neighborhoods in the metropolitan area, not just within the same political jurisdiction. And those two together will determine what kind of economic market we have going on in this neighborhood, what the vacancy rates will be, what the rent levels and housing prices will be. And those, in turn, will sort the population. It will allow certain kinds of households to move in and other kinds of households not to be able to move in. So that, in turn, this profile, if you will, of in-movers and out-movers will, in turn, generate a variety of knock-on effects, if you will. First of all, it'll affect the aggregate demographic and economic profile of who's living there at any one moment. You put the inflows and the outflows together, and you get a profile of who's there. The second thing it will do is put the tenure profile of the neighborhood in relief. What's the percentage of homeowners versus absentee owners? Last, it'll tell something about social cohesion and control. Not only who is living there, but how fast does the population turn over. Now, of course, all these dimensions have consequences as well. Let me talk about some of them. If you take the aggregate profile of the neighborhood in terms of its demographic and economic profile, that has consequences for a whole variety of other physical and safety dimensions of the neighborhood. It will affect, for example, what kind of local retail sector we have. If the neighborhood's of high income, you might have banks. If it's of lower income, you might have check cashing outlets. This aggregate profile of the people will affect what kind of housing maintenance and renovations go on. Is it a high-income, yuppifying group that's going to rehab their homes, or a lower-income group that's just hanging on by their fingernails? That profile of the neighborhood will also, of course, affect what kind of resources the neighbors can bring to bear to create social control or lack of social control. Well, in combination, these kinds of social dimensions of the neighborhood, aspects of the neighborhood's housing stock, and aspects of the neighborhood's retail sector have other consequences, and now we're moving along to the right-hand side of the diagram. All of those things will affect how people use that space. So the routine activities that we take, do we walk or do we use the car? Is there a local store to walk to or not? Will all affect how we use that space. How we use that space, of course, will set it up for different kinds of effects on the neighborhood safety. Are there going to be people walking about or not walking about? Are there going to be particular traffic flows that make people vulnerable to attack or less vulnerable to attack? And of course, our particular focus in this study is this. Will the decisions of landlords and owners to maintain or under-maintain or in the extreme abandon their properties shape the physical environment in such a way that that will shape the safety? So obviously a ton of connections, both directly and indirectly, are implicit in this model in trying to understand what the crime rate observed in a neighborhood is at any snapshot in time. Now, if that weren't complicated enough, and Lord knows it is, then of course there's feedback effects over time. Because a neighborhood's observed crime rate at any given moment is going to affect at later moments in time how the future trajectory of that neighborhood goes. So that's where this feedback effect is going. Crime rate in turn is going to feedback on the investment behaviors of owners in the future. It feedbacks in terms of who moves in and who moves out. It's going to obviously be capitalized in dwelling rents and property values. It's going to be affecting what the relative position of that neighborhood is in the metropolitan hierarchy. And so this endogenous process between market position, types of people moving into a neighborhood, changes in the social environment, changes in the physical environment, changes in the safety, all become one part of this larger systemic view of neighborhood crime. And yes, I would love to someday estimate an econometric model which does all of this path, but not yet. What I do is a much more simplified view of this that looks at the number of crimes of a particular type, and I disaggregate this by a wide variety of crime types in the neighborhood for a particular quarter as a function of several features of the landscape. We're most interested in the number of abandoned homes, and vacant lots, population density, and we're also interested in a variety of housing characteristics, the age of the house, whether it's owner-occupied or not, its condition, and so forth. We're interested in population characteristics demographically and socioeconomically, and we're interested in the local business environment. What kind of local retail do we have? Especially, how many liquor outlets do we have in the neighborhood? We get an analysis of violent crime, also broken down by certain categories. We do an analysis of property crime, broken down by certain categories, because you wouldn't expect different aspects of the neighborhood to have similar effects on all types of crime. We won't go into the details about the econometrics because statistics show that after about 5 minutes of talking about negative binomial regressions, about 10% of the audience is fantasizing about sex. And after 15 minutes of talking about negative binomial regression, about 68% of the audience is fantasizing about sex. And after 20 minutes of talking about negative binomial regression, I start fantasizing about sex. So we are analyzing over 11,000 census blocks, very small neighborhoods within the city of Detroit for our analysis. And we get data from a variety of sources. The Detroit Police Department finally released some of their data. We get information about local employment rates. We get information about local liquor licenses, both on-premises and off-premises sales. We get information about where local schools are. So we've plotted whether children are walking to a nearby school as they're going by this block. And so we end up plotting all this stuff. And here's what my hometown looks like in terms of a portrait of violent crime. Just to give you a sense of the geography, you're not familiar with the Motor City, this is the Detroit River. This big blank area is Canada. And here's a factoid that you can use at your next cocktail party. Detroit's the only place in the United States where you look south to see Canada. This is the famous 8 Mile Road, made famous by Eminem. These are two separate municipalities, Highland Park and Hamtramck, that are completely surrounded by the city of Detroit. Woodward, the spine street runs from here to the Central Business District, the former Central Business District there. And the coding, as you can imagine, tells where the highest rates of violent crime are in my city. It's clearly highly varied, as other people have suggested. There are safer neighborhoods and more dangerous neighborhoods, even in Detroit. This is the pattern for property crime. As a personal note, I experience both versions of this map because I live right here in a very low property crime neighborhood, and I work right here at Wayne State University. Okay. Results. In general, we find that neighborhoods are less safe when they are, everything else being equal, occupied by renters as opposed to homeowners, where there are more liquor licenses on the block, where there's a lower population density, and where, not surprisingly, there's more crime on adjacent blocks. There are spillover effects. Thanks, Luke. We did your techniques here. To give you a sense of how big some of these relationships are, if you compare two neighborhoods that are otherwise equal, but one has a 10% higher rate of renter occupancy, you're going to get an expectation of a higher property crime rate by 5% and a higher violent crime rate by 9%. If you compare two blocks that are otherwise equal, but they differ by 10 percentage points in their vacancy rate, you're going to see a higher burglary rate, but a lower larceny rate. A higher vacancy rate on nearby blocks has an interesting consequence here. It implies a higher robbery rate, but a lower burglary rate. Perhaps the burglary rate effect is such that other blocks, if they have more vacant houses on them, are more attractive targets for burglars. They see more vulnerable targets, and they pull potential break-in folks away from your block into these more attractive targets nearby. But most interestingly, the vacant lot rate. If that's 10 percentage points higher, you're going to see substantial reductions in crime. Not too surprisingly, there's not anything to steal from vacant lots, and it doesn't offer any cover for the bad guys as they're trying to move from one target to another. So these are, I think, relatively expected results. There are other results which are perhaps a little more surprising. Most of all is that our key variable, the key conventional wisdom, was not supported. We couldn't find any relationship between abandoned buildings, either on this block or on nearby blocks, that predicted any kind of crime. Also superficially surprising was our finding that higher rates of employment on a block were related with higher rates of nearly every crime type. Now, we're controlling for the median incomes of blocks, so what we're saying here is that controlling for basic economic levels of a block, the higher of rates of people being employed leads to higher crime on that block. Now, there's a couple of reasons that might be behind the scenes here. One is that if you are employed, you're not going to be at home as much. That means your property is more vulnerable to attack. It also means that you're not there on the street to be an eye enforcing local social control, but at least it confounds the conventional wisdom that higher SES indicators always suggest safer places. Not necessarily true. Then what we do is we try to take our empirical results and see what it means for a stylized neighborhood that goes through the classic 5 stages of decline. And so what we do is we take quintiles of Detroit neighborhoods from the strongest to the weakest, and we take the values of all of the explanatory variables in our model for the midpoint of the quintile that that particular kind of neighborhood is in, and then we predict for that particular hypothetical neighborhood, for that quintile, what the crime rate is going to be. And then we see how that crime rate will change as this archetypical neighborhood goes from a healthy situation to a threatened situation to eventually the 5th bombed out vacant kind of context. And what you get is a picture like this. Now, this graph is not in the usual fashion, so I have to briefly underscore what the horizontal axis is portraying. Each data point on the horizontal axis is what the crime rate change is as you move from one stage of neighborhood health to another. So the far left-hand portrait here, from 1 to 2, suggests that as you move from a healthy to an incipient decline kind of stage of neighborhood dynamics, you will see that neighborhood's crime rate go up by about 24%. As it goes through subsequent stages of decline, the crime rate keeps going up, but at a substantially lower rate, until it gets to that transition from the almost worst to the worst stage in terms of being virtually all abandoned and vacant. And then the crime rate jumps up even more dramatically. And as you'll see, this is true for both property crime and violent crime. So what does all this mean for policies that are being discussed in the city of Detroit right now? Where, as I mentioned, there's this massive effort to demolish abandoned buildings. Ironically, we don't have any evidence that demolishing the abandoned buildings itself is going to do anything. However, if you're creating vacant lots thereby, that might do something. Compared to an occupied building, a vacant lot does predict lower crime, but interestingly, compared to an occupied building, an abandoned one does not predict higher crime. There's also higher crime, though, in vacant buildings. Not ones that are completely bombed out, but vacant buildings. It's vacant ones, if anything, that are associated with the highest crime rates. But this has implications for right sizing. Now, this is called changing the footprint in some contexts, but I think you get the notion that when some areas just become so emptied out that there's only a couple of households left, why not encourage those few households to move to viable neighborhoods? Let those houses go, the city can knock them down, you'll have just a big vacant territory where there's no crime rate and nobody there to worry about whatever the crime rate is. Now, this is a challenge politically, and I'm not suggesting it's easy. In fact, we've backed away from it because of the political challenges. But our models suggest that it would be a win-win situation if we could do it, because it suggests that in the neighborhoods from which we are pulling the remnant vestigial population, you would get lower crime rates there. And it also suggests that if we're moving these people to fill vacant units in stronger neighborhoods, we would reduce crime there. So we'd reduce crime in the emptying neighborhoods, we would reduce crime in the higher densifying neighborhoods, and thus get an aggregate reduction in crime in the city as a whole. If only the politics seemed to permit that in a regime where we can't use eminent domain anymore. Subjects for other discussions. I will stop at this point. Thank you very much.